Welcome to Lecture 27. Today, things are going to warm up a bit. We're going to explore some of the early 19th century ideas about heat. Not so much what heat was thought to be. That we'll come back to in a later lecture. Today's concern has to do with how heat behaves, with the laws that it follows. This subject is important because of the central role heat plays among nature's many forces. I know I highlighted how important motive force was in Lecture 25, and it's true. Without motive force, without the ability to make matter move, there isn't anything much to talk about. Motive force is a crucial force in nature. But so is heat, although for a different kind of reason. Heat is important because it's so ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Whenever one force is used to produce another, almost without exception, heat will also make an appearance. And that, as we'll see, is significant. Heat also has other characteristics we need to know about, and we'll learn about two of them today. First, let me raise an interesting question from the inventions that electromagnetism made possible. We discussed some of these last time. It's a question about the interrelationships among forces. Take a generator. By turning a coil of wire mechanically in a magnetic field, we interrupt that field, and that produces electrical current. Now, here's the question. In this circumstance, is the mechanical force we employ to turn the coil merely made use of to produce the electrical force of a current? Or is the mechanical force converted to, does it become electrical force? Or take an electric motor. In an electric motor, we start with electrical current and we end up with the rotating mechanical motion of the armature. In this case, is the electrical force of the current merely made use of in obtaining the mechanical rotation, or does the electrical force become mechanical force? Let me put it in a slightly different way. If we start with a limited amount of mechanical force for our generator, say we're going to turn the coil in the magnetic field by allowing a weight to drop through a small distance. That's a limited amount of mechanical force. Say we've rigged up our generator so that as the weight falls, it turns the coil in the magnetic field and thus generates a small current in the coil. Now, has the mechanical force here merely been made use of to produce the current, or has the mechanical force actually become the electrical force? Say it's the first case. Say it's merely been used but not used up. Then it should still be around. It should be recoverable so that we could use it again. But in the second case, where the mechanical force is said to become the electrical force, the mechanical force is no longer around. It has been lost as mechanical force, but the force continues to exist as electrical force. I hope you see the different implications that these two possible interpretations have. We're going to unpack this issue today as we meet some early attempts to understand the behavior of heat. They came about as French natural philosophers from the early decades of the 19th century began to explore the relationship between heat and motive force. This was an important question right around this time because society more or less had forced the issue to front and center. How? Well, the use of heat to obtain motive force was very much evident in the invention of the steam engine. And the steam engine was one of the most important symbols of the industrialization process that was well underway by the beginning of the 19th century. It was a major symbol of the shift away from animal power to inanimate power that accompanied the Industrial Revolution. It wasn't the only indication of this trend. Falling water was also used as a favorite source of power to turn the wheels of a mill. But the power that steam generated when it turned heat into the rotating motions of drive belts and gears was particularly well suited to the burgeoning textile industry, to say nothing of its use in pumping water out of mines. But, you say, the steam engine was invented in the 18th century. How come natural philosophers are still trying to figure out the theory behind it in the 19th century? That's a very good question, and it allows me to make an important point about the relationship between natural science and technology. I haven't spoken much about the history of technology in this series of lectures. That's because we've been focusing on science itself. The general point I want to make here has to do with the direction of influence between science and technology. I often encounter in students and in others the assumption that the direction of influence is from science to technology. And sometimes it's true that natural philosophers figure out some new theory, then others come along and find an application for it. That's pretty much what occurred in the aftermath of the discovery of electromagnetism. But the point is that this isn't always the direction of the flow of influence. Sometimes it's the other way around, and the steam engine is a case in point. Thomas Newcomen and later James Watt had built effective steam engines well before the theory of how they operated was understood. In Newcomen's case, a full century before. In fact, the steam engine provided the occasion for the birth of a new science, thermodynamics, as we'll see. So perhaps you can understand why one scholar has observed that science learned a lot more from the steam engine than the steam engine learned from science. So now let's turn our attention to figuring out how a science of heat came about. We're going to do this in two stages. We'll begin with a brief look at one of the first natural philosophers. Actually, he'd made his name as a mathematician, but at any rate, one of the first people to consider the behavior of heat from a theoretical point of view. Then we'll come to the person who used the steam engine as the occasion for asking an intriguing and fundamental set of questions about the way that heat is used to produce motive force. So among the first to consider heat from a theoretical as opposed to a practical point of view was the French mathematician Joseph Fourier. Fourier, like Faraday, was born into humble surroundings. He was older than Faraday. In fact, he was already 21 when the French Revolution broke out. Coming from the poorer classes as he did, it doesn't surprise us that this enthusiastic youth displayed natural sympathies for the revolution when it came. In fact, he'd been destined to go into the priesthood. Just 2 years before the revolution, he'd entered a Benedictine abbey to begin his studies. His instructors right away noticed the amazing abilities in mathematics that he'd brought with him. Fourier loved mathematics, and he continued to cultivate his interest in it. He kept up with his education as the revolution unfolded, but he gave up his idea of the priesthood in favor of becoming a teacher. So in 1791, he took a position at a Benedictine college. But he was still enthusiastic for the political change that was occurring and became active in the local revolutionary committee. That was a dangerous path to tread because, as we've seen in our earlier discussions, things could turn against one quickly. Fourier, in fact, did become entangled in some internal differences of opinion during the year of the Reign of Terror, and that was the most dangerous time of all. But he survived the revolution and became a teacher at the newly established École Polytechnique. It was his mathematical abilities that distinguished him, and he soon acquired an important position there. Once things began to settle down, at least a little, Fourier was tapped by the rising young French military star, Napoleon Bonaparte, who had an idea to gain glory for France by conquering Egypt. Napoleon persuaded Fourier to go along in the summer of 1798 as a technical advisor. The Egyptian campaign was by all accounts a disaster, although Napoleon emerged from his failure relatively unscathed. Later, when he was Emperor of France, Napoleon appointed Fourier prefect of Grenoble. It was during this first decade of the 19th century that Fourier devoted himself to the study of heat. Now, Fourier wasn't interested in steam engines. His question was a very theoretical one. How does heat flow through solid bodies? Can I capture the way heat flows in bodies in a mathematical description? Now, let me just tell you that Fourier did do what he set out to do. The brilliance of the mathematical techniques he developed to express his results was not recognized until later. In fact, these very techniques have now become a central tool of mathematical physics. And in addition to these innovative mathematical techniques, Fourier took an unconventional, almost an unacceptable approach to the problem. I'll tell you what that was in just a second, but perhaps you can see why at first his work was not well received and wasn't even published. It was eventually published in 1822. His book, which was called The Analytical Theory of Heat, appeared, and the merit of his work began to be recognized. Now, we don't need to go into the complex mathematics Fourier used in his analysis. I just want to focus on that unconventional aspect of Fourier's treatment of heat, the one that didn't particularly endear him to his colleagues. It's something, incidentally, that links him to Ørsted. Not in the specific result, but in the kind of result he'd come to. Like Ørsted, Fourier brought a non-Newtonian element into physics. Ørsted had introduced the idea of a circular force. We saw how impossible that was for classical Newtonian minds like Ampère to accept. In Fourier's case, the non-Newtonian element showed itself differently. It had to do with the way heat flowed. And it was this: the laws Fourier had formulated for the conduction of heat implied that heat flow was not reversible. So what's the big deal here? Why is that so hard to swallow? Well, the mechanical laws Newton formulated to describe how the machinery of nature ran were reversible. That is, they could be thought of as running backward as easily as forward. In theory, there was no reason at all why you couldn't think of the universe as running backwards as easily as forwards. That's how, in fact, Halley had uncovered the discrepancies between Newton's theory and the ancient records of eclipses of the moon that we discussed back in Lecture 2. He'd run the system backwards to see where the moon should have been and found that the theory said it was one place when the actual historical record said it was another. So nature's laws shouldn't be irreversible. They shouldn't describe behavior that went one direction only and couldn't be thought of as running backwards because they weren't like mechanical processes. There was another problem. Recall that Pierre Laplace had suggested in his system of the world that the cosmos was stable and that implied it was also eternal. It would run on forever. In fact, our old friend John Playfair from Lecture 17, he was the defender of Hutton's theory of the Earth. He'd taken this very idea from Laplace's work. In his book of 1802, he said, and I'm quoting, "All the variations of our solar system are periodical. The system is thus endowed with a stability which can resist the lapse of unlimited duration. It can only perish by an external cause." But what if there were irreversible processes in nature? What then? Would that mean that Laplace might be wrong? Fourier's depiction of an irreversible flow of heat, then, is the second instance we have met in which nature appeared to escape the confines of Newtonian laws. Let's now turn to the second stage of our story. This is the one that relates directly to the steam engine, and it involves another Frenchman from around this time who also had become fascinated by the theoretical study of heat, this time as it appeared in the steam engine. His name was Sadi Carnot. Unlike Fourier, he came from an important family in France. Well, it hadn't always been an important family. His father, Lazare Carnot, had come from modest social origins back in the old regime, but he'd risen far. He'd chosen a military career, and that sent him through schooling that exposed him to mathematics and natural science, and he'd excelled in those subjects. During the Revolution, Lazare continued to rise fast. At one point, he was a member of the Committee of Public Safety, and then was put in charge of several armies defending France. After the Revolution, he'd risen so far that he became one of the 5 directors. That was the ruling body that replaced the National Convention in 1795. In fact, he became president of the Directory. And he continued to remain close to the sources of power during the tumultuous political events after Napoleon became ruler. But by 1807, he'd had enough and he decided to retire from public life, Lazare. So Lazare decided that his son, Sadi, would receive the benefit of an excellent education, and there was no one better to guarantee that than Lazare himself, who'd studied mathematics and mechanics, and he'd actually written books on those subjects. So he did everything he could to prepare his son for successful study at the increasingly famous school for technical education, the École Polytechnique. It worked because Sadi completed his studies in engineering, math, and science, and then, as expected, entered the military. And then in 1819, Sadi passed a competitive examination that enabled him to move to Paris and to enjoy free time to pursue his own interests. This was good for the future of natural science because young Carnot had developed a curiosity about some important practical questions concerning heat engines. His father had written on machines and their operation, so maybe it was something in the family blood. Anyway, one of the questions Carnot wanted to answer was whether there was a maximal amount of motive force that could be obtained using a certain amount of heat. Say a steam engine puts out a certain amount of heat. Is there a limit to the amount of motive force you can get from that heat? Another question was whether some substances were better than others in producing a given amount of motive force. Say I use coal to produce the heat. Is that better than using wood in terms of the amount of motive force I get? These were very practical questions. Now, people who actually worked steam engines could use trial and error to answer these questions. They could determine from experience if different engines produced different amounts of motive force from the same quantity of heat. But those folks had no interest in thinking about the question theoretically. What more could they get from that? They knew what they had to know. But Carnot was not someone who actually used steam engines to make a living, and he was interested in the theoretical side of the question. So it was in his pursuit of these theoretical questions that Carnot came upon a very important insight whose implications would take some time to appreciate. Here it is in a nutshell. We'll have to tease out why it's so important as we go along. Carnot realized that if heat were going to be used to produce motive force, then the only way that could happen was if heat at a higher temperature fell to a lower temperature. Okay, that's the insight. Just file it away for a moment. Try to remember it. If heat is going to be used to produce motive force, the only way that can happen is if heat at a higher temperature falls to a lower temperature. Well, he put down his ideas on this subject in a book of 1824 entitled Reflections on the Motive Power of Heat. This was a work he thought would be useful to those concerned with the problem of fuel economy. He wasn't thinking of the book as a theoretical work in physical science, but it certainly would become a key work in the history of physics. Well, why was Carnot's insight so key? And how are we to understand his explanation? Let me start my answer by bringing up something you're already familiar with. I'm thinking of Benjamin Franklin and his explanation of the Leyden jar. You see, Carnot thought of the production of motive force from heat as nature's response to a disturbance in a normally balanced state. We met this situation in Franklin's explanation of the behavior of electrical fluid in the case of the Leyden jar in Lecture 11. There, an equilibrium amount of electrical fluid was disturbed by forcibly accumulating an excess amount inside a glass jar. That produced a positive charge that exerted electrical force. Carnot viewed the steam engine as another way of disturbing a normal state, then presenting nature with an opportunity to restore the original state. Now, I should clear up right now that the heat engine Carnot imagined was an ideal engine. An ideal heat engine is one in which parts are considered weightless and no heat is lost to friction or by conduction. He didn't worry about friction or such things. And Carnot didn't commit himself in his book to a particular view of what heat was. That was a controversial subject, as we'll learn in Lecture 29. Most of his readers, however, took him to mean that heat was a weightless fluid that Lavoisier had called caloric. Caloric was one of those imponderable substances. It was the weightless material element of heat, which when combined with gross material bodies, made them warm. It was supposedly present in or attached to all matter. How much caloric was present was a measure of the matter's temperature. For example, the temperature of air in the chamber of a steam engine depended on how much caloric was present in the volume of the chamber. If you packed more caloric in there, then the temperature would go up. So you could say that the temperature was an index of the density of the caloric. Now, with these assumptions, Carnot proceeded to analyze how disturbing and then restoring an equilibrium state could tell us how a steam engine is able to produce motive force. First, imagine a cylinder with a movable piston that expands the volume of the cylinder on its upstroke and compresses the volume on its downstroke. So imagine that. Got it? Okay. Now, before the operation begins, the system is static and in equilibrium. The piston's not moving because everything is balanced. Carnot assumed that nature would maintain that equilibrium if at all possible. Okay, now we're going to introduce some extra caloric into the cylinder. We'll do this by bringing the cylinder into contact with a body that's made hot by steam. We'll call its temperature T1. So while the cylinder is touching the body with the steam, caloric flows into the cylinder. When this extra caloric is introduced by admitting steam briefly into the chamber, nature reacts. Nature will keep the situation at equilibrium if at all possible. So nature retains the equilibrium in the system by providing motive force, by moving the piston at the top of the chamber up so that the volume of the chamber inside the cylinder increases. So we've increased caloric, but we've now increased the volume as well, and that keeps the density of the caloric the same. In other words, the temperature remains constant here. We still have equilibrium as long as we maintain the original density of caloric. Okay, remove the cylinder from its contact with this hot body. No more steam flows in. Now, when the addition of heat is suddenly stopped, the piston doesn't instantly cease its motion. It keeps going up a bit. And when that happens, the volume of the chamber expands more than is necessary to maintain equilibrium. So now we have an unstable situation. We no longer have equilibrium. The density of the caloric has decreased as the extra volume is added. And what that does, actually I should ask, what does that mean? It means that the temperature has to begin to drop from T1. No longer is there equilibrium in the system because the normal density of the caloric has been reduced. Now, nature doesn't like this. Nature will keep things in equilibrium if at all possible. So, nature tries to reestablish equilibrium. But that can't happen unless somehow an opportunity is made available to restore the normal density of the caloric. One way to accomplish this would be to find a way to remove the excess caloric from the chamber that we introduced. And we can do that if we can find a cold body to which we can give that extra caloric. So if we now bring the cylinder into contact with a cold body, say at temperature T2, we provide a means for nature to restore the original equilibrium. Nature reacts to this opportunity by forcing the excess caloric to flow out to the cold body by decreasing the volume, that is, moving the piston down. At first, the loss of caloric is compensated for by the decreased volume, so the lower density of the caloric doesn't immediately change, but if the system is to return to its starting point, equilibrium has to be restored. When all of the excess caloric has been surrendered to the cold body, the piston, once again, does not suddenly stop, but continues to move down. Now, the continued descent of the piston means that you're decreasing the volume in the chamber, and that means that the density can increase, which it does until the original density of the caloric, that is the original temperature, is reached. Equilibrium has been restored. Now, what did Carnot learn from this analysis? What are the implications for our question about using one form of force to obtain another, as opposed to converting one kind of force into another? First, heat can only be used to move a piston up and down, provided that it could be given to a body that was colder. That was his insight about a fall in temperature being necessary if you're going to use heat to obtain motive force. Carnot was very clear about this. Of course, the motive power of the engine depended on the production of heat to supply the extra caloric at the beginning, but it also depended on the availability of cold. Without the latter, Carnot tells us, and these are his words, without the latter, the heat is useless. In fact, Carnot determined the specific motive power you could produce from heat was due to two factors: the amount of heat, that is, the extra caloric supplied, and the size of the temperature fall. He was beginning to get a handle on those practical questions he started with. You remember, the one about whether there was a maximal amount of motive force that could be obtained using a certain amount of heat. Carnot inferred one more thing from his analysis. It goes back to the two options I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture where the relationships among forces are concerned. Is heat merely made use of to produce motive force, or is heat used up, converted into motive force? Let's see what Carnot says about that. Carnot says this, and I quote, "The production of motive power is then due in steam engines not to an actual consumption of caloric, but to its transportation from a warm body to a cold body, that is, to its reestablishment of equilibrium." I guess that makes clear which side he's on. Carnot's idea of how heat is used here is similar to the way water is used in a mill wheel. Water flows in at the top, descends with the turning wheel, runs out the bottom. Water is delivered from one place to another without being consumed in the process. A simple way of putting this is that for Carnot, heat was conserved. You don't use it up, you just move it around. Now we'll see that there's going to be some problems with this conclusion of Carnot's, but let's not lose sight of his key insight. To use heat to produce mechanical force, there has to be a fall in temperature. That would stay. But he wasn't done yet. Remember the other question Carnot had asked? The one about whether some substances were better than others in producing a given amount of motive force? Carnot's analysis allowed him to solve this problem. If motive power depended on the difference in temperature between the hot body and the cold body, then the substance used to supply the heat was not important. The maximum theoretical power obtainable from a given amount of heat from steam was the same as the maximum power that could be obtained from that same amount of heat supplied by any substance at all. That settled that. A second conclusion was even more surprising because it was based on the understandable assumption that some heat engines must be more efficient than others. Remember, his heat engine was an ideal one, so he imagined it was reversible. It didn't involve the flow of heat as Fourier understood it. So Carnot imagined that he could think of a heat engine running backwards. In that case, he'd take heat from a cold body and deliver it to a hot body. He knew this was only something he could think of about in the ideal, as a thought experiment, but he had a reason for pursuing it. Say he had a real efficient heat engine. What if he used that one to drive a second, less efficient one in reverse direction? The second one would take heat from a cold body and deliver it to a hot body. But if the first were more efficient than the second one, that was going backwards, then the first one would use less power than the second one would as they went through their respective cycles. That would mean that the caloric used by the first engine would have been put back by the engine it was driving backwards, but that there would be some extra power left over from the first engine because it was more efficient. Well, the implication of that was mind-boggling. It suggested that the process could go on forever, that you'd have a perpetual motion machine. But Carnot, and everyone else, regarded that as impossible. So that had to mean that his assumption was wrong. You couldn't have ideal reversible heat engines that had different efficiencies. All ideal reversible heat engines must have the same efficiency. These remarkable conclusions about heat were just the beginning of the new science of thermodynamics. We'll learn just how important they were when we come to the famous second law of thermodynamics in Lecture 31. Since that law also gets us entangled in a 19th century version of culture wars, we need first to catch up on what's been going on in the relationship between science and culture from this period. And that we'll do in our next lecture.